In 1976, a 22-year-old news anchor in Baltimore was told she was unfit for television because she could not separate her personal feelings from the nightly news. It was a humiliating dismissal that felt like the end of a career before it had even begun. Yet, that rejection was the exact catalyst required to forge a new path. Oprah Winfrey would go on to transform the landscape of American media, turning raw vulnerability into a multi-billion-dollar currency. Her rise was not a linear progression of luck, but a calculated, often grueling, march toward total independence. How does a woman dismissed for showing too much humanity become the most influential voice in the world? The answer lies in how she weaponized her own trauma to dismantle the barrier between the celebrity and the viewer. This is the story of how a girl from Mississippi redefined the power of the broadcast. The story begins in Kosciuszko, Mississippi, in 1954. Born to a teenage mother and a father serving in the military, Oprah's early years were defined by instability and profound trauma. She moved between the homes of her grandmother, Hattie Mae, and her mother, Vernita, struggling for a sense of belonging in a deeply segregated South. The landscape of her childhood was one of scarcity and intense religious discipline, where the church served as her first stage. By age 3, she was reciting verses, discovering that the sound of her own voice could command attention and silence a room. Her grandmother taught her to read before she was 3, fostering an intellectual hunger that far outpaced her peers. But this precocious development masked a dark reality. The trauma of abuse left a silent, heavy weight on her development. She escaped through books and performance, finding an identity in the stories she consumed. By the time she moved to Nashville to live with her father, Vernon, in the early 1960s, she was a young woman who had seen more tragedy than most encounter in a lifetime. Vernon was a strict disciplinarian, enforcing rules and prioritizing education with an intensity that terrified her but ultimately provided the structure she lacked. He was the one who insisted she visit the local library every 2 weeks, pushing her toward excellence. At East Nashville High School, she became a standout, winning a public speaking contest that earned her a scholarship to Tennessee State University. She was no longer just a girl from a rural shack, she was a rising star in the making. She became the first black woman to anchor the news at Nashville's WLAC-TV while still a teenager. This success was intoxicating, but it was merely the prologue. The professional world was about to test her limits in ways she had never imagined. The transition from high school prodigy to adult professional was jagged, and the industry was not prepared for a black woman who refused to fit into a preordained, clinical box. She was gaining momentum, but the structures of 1970s media were designed to break people who showed too much heart. In 1976, Oprah moved to Baltimore to co-anchor the 6 p.m. news at WJZ-TV. The industry expected a detached, objective reader, a human teleprompter. Oprah, however, was fundamentally different. She felt the weight of the stories she reported, reacting with empathy and raw emotion that made executives uncomfortable. When she was fired from the anchor chair and demoted to a talk show called People Are Talking, it was meant to be a professional death sentence. Instead, it was an epiphany. On that daytime stage, she realized she didn't need to read a script, she needed to have a conversation. The shift was seismic. She discovered that her ability to listen, to truly hear her guests, was her greatest asset. She wasn't just performing, she was connecting. As the show's ratings climbed, she realized that the daytime format was a goldmine of untapped intimacy. She wasn't just another TV host, she was becoming a surrogate for the audience. By 1984, she was recruited to host AM Chicago, a failing morning show that was languishing at the bottom of the ratings. Within months, she had overtaken the dominant competitor, Donahue. She brought a style of vulnerability that terrified the traditional media establishment. She discussed her childhood abuse, her struggles with weight, and her complicated relationships with a transparency that was unheard of in the mid-1980s. The audience didn't just watch Oprah, they felt seen by her. The producers at ABC took notice, and in 1986, AM Chicago was rebranded as The Oprah Winfrey Show and went national. Suddenly, she was reaching millions of homes every single day. She was no longer a local news personality, she was entering the living rooms of America as a trusted confidant. The rise was rapid, but it was also incredibly fragile. She was a black woman in a white-dominated industry, navigating a landscape that had never seen her type of success. She was constantly under the microscope, criticized for her weight, her clothing, and her perceived lack of journalistic rigor. But she ignored the noise, focusing entirely on the singular bond she was building with her audience. She was preparing for a move that would change the economics of television forever, the fight for ownership. By the late 1980s, Oprah was the most popular host on daytime television, but she was still an employee. She understood the fundamental rule of media wealth: you don't build an empire by working for someone else, you build it by owning the content. In 1988, she took a massive gamble. She leveraged her massive ratings to negotiate a deal that gave her ownership of The Oprah Winfrey Show through her own production company, Harpo Productions. It was an unprecedented move for a television personality, especially a black woman. With this control, she was no longer just the face of the brand, she was the brand itself. She moved production to Chicago, creating a hub of influence that would eventually employ hundreds and generate billions in revenue. She wasn't just making a show, she was building a media infrastructure. She began to diversify her interests, producing movies like The Color Purple and Beloved, showing a willingness to engage with heavy, uncomfortable subject matter that further cemented her reputation as a force of nature. In the 1990s, the power of the Oprah effect became a cultural phenomenon. A single mention of a book on her show could turn an unknown author into a global bestseller overnight. She had created a closed loop of trust where the audience believed in her recommendations as if they were coming from a family member. She was a one-woman engine of commerce. Every decision was deliberate. She avoided the typical traps of celebrity excess, instead reinvesting her profits back into Harpo. She was disciplined and ruthless about her brand's image, demanding perfection from her staff. She was also keenly aware that to stay relevant, she had to constantly evolve. She wasn't just a talk show host anymore, she was a cultural arbiter, a publisher, and a producer. Her influence crossed social, racial, and economic lines, making her the most trusted figure in America. But the pressure to maintain this level of perfection was immense. Behind the scenes, the demands of the brand began to take a toll. She was juggling a massive corporate empire while still fronting a show that required her to be emotionally available 5 days a week. The strain was beginning to show, and the competition was starting to catch up. As the 1990s bled into the 2000s, the talk show landscape became saturated with copycats. Every network wanted their own Oprah, leading to a glut of tabloid-style daytime shows that focused on sensationalism and conflict. Oprah's response was a pivot toward Live Your Best Life, a brand of aspirational, self-help-focused content that moved away from the more sensational, shock talk of her early years. She leaned into spirituality, wellness, and literature, curating a life that her audience could aspire to emulate. This was a masterstroke of branding. She wasn't just teaching people how to cook or dress, she was teaching them how to live. By the time she launched the Oprah magazine, in 2000, she had successfully extended her brand into print. It was a massive financial success, proving that her audience would follow her across any medium. She was no longer just a broadcaster, she was a lifestyle architect. But success brought its own unique set of problems. She was frequently attacked by critics who viewed her self-help gospel as superficial or self-indulgent. There were high-profile missteps, most notably the James Fry, A Million Little Pieces scandal, where she discovered that an author she had championed on her show had fabricated significant portions of his memoir. The public fallout was brutal. She had to sit on her own stage and confront the author, admitting her own failure in vetting the book. It was a moment of profound vulnerability that, in typical Oprah fashion, she turned into a lesson on truth. She didn't hide from the mistake, she owned it. This ability to absorb a blow and transform it into a moment of accountability was a defining trait of her career. She was operating at a level where every move was scrutinized, yet she remained the most powerful woman in television. Her net worth was climbing into the hundreds of millions, and her influence was global. She was becoming a billionaire, but she was also realizing that the medium that had made her, the daytime talk show, was nearing its natural end. The rise had been spectacular, but now she faced the most difficult challenge of her career: how to walk away from the things she built without losing her relevance. The decision to end The Oprah Winfrey Show in 2011 was not a retreat, it was a desperate attempt to pivot toward a new horizon. The digital age was dawning, and the traditional daytime talk show was being cannibalized by the internet. Oprah's answer was the launch of her own cable network, OWN, the Oprah Winfrey Network. It was supposed to be the jewel in her crown, the ultimate culmination of her life's work. She poured over $300 million of her own capital into the project, believing that her personal brand was powerful enough to carry an entire 24-hour channel. She was wrong. The network struggled from day one. Ratings were abysmal, the programming was unfocused, and the transition from host to network executive proved to be a brutal learning curve. She wasn't just managing a show, she was managing a massive, complex corporate entity, and the results were disastrous. The network was bleeding cash, and the press began to write her off. They called it Oprah's folly, suggesting that she had finally overreached. She had spent decades being the most successful person in her field, and suddenly, she was failing in the most public way possible. The pressure was immense. She had to make the hardest decision of her professional life: she had to step into the role of CEO full-time. She left her home in California and moved to Los Angeles to take direct control of the network's daily operations. It was a humbling experience for someone who had spent her life as the talent, not the manager. She had to cut costs, fire staff, and retool the programming from the ground up. It was a period of intense crisis, where the question wasn't how she would grow, but how she would survive. She had to shed the identity of the talk show host to become the leader she needed to be. The transition was agonizing. Every ratings report was a reminder of her failure. But she held firm, relying on the same grit that had pulled her out of poverty in Mississippi. She began to find a niche for the network, focusing on high-quality scripted dramas like Queen Sugar and Greenleaf. She was learning that the rules of the game had changed, and she had to be willing to kill her own darlings to stay in the race. This was the moment where her legacy was truly at stake. She was no longer competing with other talk show hosts. She was competing with a changing world that was rapidly moving away from the kind of television she had perfected. By 2015, the network finally turned a profit, but the victory felt different. The media landscape had shifted toward streaming and on-demand content, and Oprah found herself playing catch-up. The struggle with OWN was a microcosm of the wider conflict she faced throughout her career, the constant tension between being a personality and being a business entity. She had to navigate the transition from a star-driven model to a content-driven model. She began to focus on producing for other platforms, including Apple TV Plus and Netflix. She realized that ownership was still important, but distribution was the new king. She wasn't just building for her own channel anymore, she was building for the entire ecosystem of modern media. This period was marked by a series of high-profile, deeply personal interviews, like the 2021 sit-down with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, that proved she still held the power to command the global cultural conversation. These were not just ratings successes, they were masterclasses in the art of the interview, proving that her core strength, the ability to create a safe space for vulnerability, hadn't diminished. She had successfully navigated the move into the streaming era, proving that her brand was not tied to a single platform. However, the path was not without its critics. She faced backlash for her support of certain figures, and the intense scrutiny of her wealth and influence never wavered. She was a billionaire in a country that had a complicated relationship with success, especially when that success was achieved by a woman of color. She had to balance her desire to be a beacon of hope with the reality of being a corporate figurehead. She learned that power is not just about reach, it is about responsibility. She shifted her focus toward philanthropy, pouring hundreds of millions into the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy for girls in South Africa. This was the true culmination of her journey. She wasn't just building a company, she was building a future for others. She understood that her wealth was a tool, not a trophy. The conflict of her later years was not about how much money she could make, but how much influence she could wield for the causes she believed in. She had moved from a girl in Mississippi to a woman who could shape the global conversation, and she did it by never forgetting the pain that started it all. Oprah Winfrey's story is not a fairy tale of instant success, it is a long, arduous process of turning trauma into an asset. She built an empire not by hiding her vulnerability, but by putting it center stage. Her legacy is not just the billions of dollars in her bank account or the influence she exerted over the media, it is the fundamental change in how we talk about our own lives. She taught a generation that speaking your truth is a revolutionary act. The lesson here is simple but profound: vulnerability turned into connection is the most powerful media strategy ever deployed. Oprah's success proves that if you can articulate the universal pain within your own personal experience, you will find an audience that never leaves you. In an era of polished, curated social media personas, Oprah's willingness to be messy, to be wrong, and to grow in public remains her most radical contribution to culture. She is now the elder stateswoman of media, a figure whose influence is measured not by ratings, but by the intellectual and emotional imprint she has left on the public consciousness. She proved that you don't have to be perfect to be powerful, you just have to be real. As she continues to produce, invest, and influence from her home in California, she remains a testament to the idea that where you start does not define where you end. Her life is the ultimate blueprint for turning the most difficult aspects of the human experience into a force for global change. She did not just take over television, she took over the way we understand ourselves. The girl from Mississippi who was told she didn't belong in front of a camera eventually became the person who decided exactly what that camera would look at. That is the true measure of her rise, and the enduring nature of her fallible, human, and extraordinary legacy.